Okay, so welcoming Hiten Shah to the show. He's been a friend and mentor of mine for a while now. So I'll let him introduce himself because you have many things under your belt. So I'll let you give a little intro.
Yeah, well, it's always great to talk to you, regardless of what's going on, whether it's in the world or our personal lives. I'm Heaton. I've built software for quite some time now, probably about over 15 years. So I feel like grandpa a lot of the times these days is kind of what I'm realizing because I see things that people say and I'm like, oh, I know about that 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I'm Hn Shah, HNSHAH on Twitter. That's probably the most public place that I exist. Besides that, I've started a couple companies, CrazyEgg and KISSmetrics. They're both SaaS analytics companies. And recently I started a company called FYI. Helps you find your documents in 3 clicks or less. It's at usefyi.com. And outside of that, I've probably spent time with like 10,000 plus founders or folks who are considering starting stuff, or even folks who work at tech companies over the last, I don't know, 17 years, maybe even more than 10,000, I don't know. So I enjoy talking to folks, and I've invested in about 150 plus companies now.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I've been very fortunate to be one of those 10,000 or more people, and I've had a few slots. I said before we start recording that we tend to do like a catch up every time I'm in San Francisco,
Yep.
just like once a year or something. We go get a coffee, walk around the block, and you tell me all the things I'm not doing quite right and should be thinking about otherwise.
That's only because you
So
ask about it. If you don't ask me, you're not going to get the answer.
exactly, but then it's
But you asked, so.
yeah, I think yeah, we can do this over Zoom now, which is great. That's we can do it publicly.
Yep.
You mentioned in your intro about being like grandfather sometimes, and you've seen it all before type of thing. So we talked about this podcast because there was like a talk about how much email or how many newsletters there are like going on right now, which is very apparent, I think, and everyone's just sat at home reading, watching, listening to things. And there's something I tweeted quite a while ago, which was like everything if you keep on Googling stuff and like how to start a startup, how to do something, you've already read it. Like, how much difference is there in what the OG articles were back when you were starting stuff, if there were many, versus what like comes out now with long form art? Everything just seems to be like gaming to get clicks and attention. It's just like this is how you really start a startup. From a person who's had like a company for 2 years versus I don't know. It seems
Yeah, I find it really fascinating. I think most of the stuff people ask me is Googleable, so I like getting into conversations where I've always been like this, where it's very contextual and relevant to the person I'm talking to. So when I look at most things that are out there that are about starting up, nothing's actually changed in the content. Zero.
yeah,
Like zero. Not 1%, not like, oh, this one thing is different or the tactics you hear about are different. Everything is literally exactly the same. And the reason for that is back in the day, there weren't that many people writing about starting things. And so the quality of that content was actually super high. And the folks who I would give a massive shout out to is the folks at Basecamp because they were one of the first to really like demonstrate how to launch software businesses, even with like a wait list or like a early access program or a rolling like number of signups. One of their products I think had like 100 a day that they were letting in, like for the first X amount of time, and they blogged about all of it, like that whole like in public and transparent. Like they were very close to that, outside of actually sharing revenue, but they were always sharing like things. And so I would say that a lot of what's old is new again. So when I see like some of these things come out, even with a twist on them, I'm very cynical about it these days because not just because of what you're saying about, oh, people are just doing it for traffic, but I think when it comes to content, newsletters, videos, courses, all these things, it's fascinating. It's almost like to me like a double-edged sword in life today, where like on one hand, I love seeing more people creating content. just any kind. Like, I think that's great. I think people getting their ideas on paper, so to speak, and putting them out there is wonderful. Also, at the same time, it's very rare for that content today to hit a bar where I'm like, oh wow, this is like educational for me. This is something I haven't heard before, read before, or it's a twist on it that's like really compelling. That's in short order. You don't find a lot of that kind of stuff out there today. What you find is what you said, like lots of the same stuff, lots of the stuff that you could have Googled and found already, but yet someone decided to write it anyway for whatever reason. Maybe they didn't Google it. Maybe they thought it was unique. And the double-edged sword for me is like, I have to appreciate the fact that there are people that are coming onto the internet and trying to do things that are new, like meaning they're new to it and they might not have heard that stuff before.
Yes.
So I don't want to hate. This is not about hate. It's just about like this reality we're in, that there's going to be more repetitive content that existed before that now for some reason exists again, and you're kind of adding to that pile. And that's what I see a lot of.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I didn't think of it like that. Of like the process or the structure of that content, whatever it is, like how to get customers type of thing. It's been around for a while because everyone who's new within the time frame has gone through the exact same thing, and the successful people who then moved to it have come to all the same conclusion of, oh, we're going to make something that people actually like. Um,
Yeah, it's kind of like a cohort thing, right? Where like new cohorts come in and then they do the same thing that old cohorts did. And these cohorts are basically people new to starting up. The thing that I love, absolutely, is when somebody shares the details of their experience doing it.
yeah,
They share the tactics, they share the numbers, and that is actually some of the most beautiful content that I love to share because it demonstrates, it actually does demonstrate how things might be different than before,
yeah,
because it talks about the tactics. And I know you've done that in the past, and a lot of your business has to do with sharing. I mean, your whole thing is about sharing the things that you started doing and then
yeah,
turning it into this platform, marketplace, whatever you want to call it. And I've just watched you iterate it. It's been fantastic. And it's similar. So I would say that, for anyone listening, if you're going to create content, like sharing your stories and the gory details of it will never get old.
yeah.
It just
I
won't.
think that's one of the things that people seem to miss or overlook every single time, even whatever context of like, oh, what podcast could I start? What email newsletter could I start? What idea, what thing can I build? When you're looking at those things, and I've definitely been guilty of this before. I'm sure I've talked to you about this. You've probably seen the evolution of me at the start saying, I want to start something, I don't know what. And then I spent all that time, product time, learning about community and like lots of different types of products. And then I learned about the no-code stuff and I learned how to put them together. And then I learned about like these people talking about their businesses publicly, and then some other sort of interest group probably came in there. And it's because I talked about all of that in one thing. That's when like those other people started coming towards. Actually, we had Greg Eisenberg an hour ago. You're talking about community versus audience. It's like when you talk about that intersection of one of your interests, there's such a huge group of people on the internet who will resonate with that piece too, and then you almost become that center of gravity for those at the interest group, and that's how you start building a community, which you then can continue to iterate on and might build a product from. Um, but yeah, I think no one must be told like, oh, it's just from experience and through your interest and through experiences where you'll come up with an idea at some point. It's just like on the internet. And that's not what people want to hear.
It's exactly right. And 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 this is why I think there is a lot of fatigue because things take a lot more vulnerability, honesty, transparency, those kind of things to really stand out from the crowd, or they're just deep. Like they just have depth. And in some ways, depth is like you writing a guide on how to, you know, build whatever it is that someone's trying to build, that, you know, out of the million
Yeah.
things that you've written, and teaching somebody how to build it using no code, without having to be an engineer. I mean, there are the best stuff is the stuff that's relevant in the world right now, and that has like this almost like tailwind effect to it, where it's like you know, you almost like find these patterns, and these patterns are like, in your case, for your business, there's a certain pattern of a type of content, type of guide, type of experience that you can create. And the funny thing is, that's the same thing that happens across people and companies too. So you're starting like the listicle. Listicles are still a thing.
Yeah.
Most of the things you see today that get a lot of traction as listicles are listicles on steroids. Like literally, it's like a beefed up, like burly like article where you're just like, damn, they must have spent a lot of time on this, or there's like a lot of illustrations to it or something. So it's almost like the bar is so high, and yet there's a lot of content that's just below the bar, you know. And that, I think that's just the reality that we live in. What I'm concerned about is the pattern that I'm seeing now, or the experience I'm seeing now, is like, even if something's high quality, that doesn't mean it's going to get the audience.
Yeah.
And that wasn't the case before, because there was just less content.
Yeah, and we'll touch on that in a sec. But the listicle thing interested me because that was my first ever product, was a version of that. It was that marketing stack. It's
Yep.
directly with marketing resources. So I just sifted through what I thought was good for social media tools or content marketing or any of these type of things. And actually, it's funny that there's another Twitter thread somewhere, and I posted something saying, well, the reason I asked Twitter for a recommendation for like a podcast mic or a piece of software that I'm trying to use is because I trust that I've somehow attracted the right people with the same interests as me, who have done the work for me at some point in time and thought, this is the podcast microphone you need, or this is the whatever you need, and this is why I recommended it to you. Whereas Google shows me 6 ads for something to do with like puppy related stuff, because I recently had a puppy and I'm talking about this thing. So it's like this whole, it's like a connection there, and the curation part, it's like always there as a bigger value piece than people
Well,
realize.
and you can trust that it's real time. You can trust that it's the latest and it's up to date, because those people are using these products, and I think trust is a big factor on content, and as a lot of our trusted sources for that type of content have sold out, not necessarily in a bad way. Someone made money. The Wirecutter is a good example. You start basically trusting them less, and then you go to Twitter because you trust Twitter because a human is going to respond to you. So I think that whole concept you said about asking about things on Twitter, the result is a listicle of some kind, and it's because we like those. And
Yeah,
this is a trusted listicle because it's not like one editorial viewpoint. It's literally everyone piling on, trying to help you out and trying to share their favorite X, basically.
yeah,
So it's funny. I see a lot of things like, there used to be, now there's less of this, but a lot of things like months ago where it's like, oh, this is an engagement hack or this and that. It's like, yeah, it gets engagement. But if I really have a question and I want the answer, or I kind of want to like sort of collectively find solutions, it's one of the best ways to do it, if not the best, fastest way to do it. Even if you have a relatively small audience, you can tweet a question, you can tweet something where people kind of, you request a reply, and it's like really robust, and it's really fast, and it's actually very high quality, and it usually hits a really high bar in terms of quality and sort of relevance. So I'm glad you mentioned that. I didn't make the connection to those two things until we started talking about it.
yeah. And it's even like um, people will rule out the things that you're debating. So if you've got like three things in your head, if 17 people say the one thing, one person says another, and then 4 others say this other one was really shitty, you're like, okay, done. Like, That's all the cognitive.
Dude, the
Needle.
quality's
Yeah,
so high and nobody loses. It takes everybody like 30 seconds to give you that response. It's not a big deal, right? That form of community that's instant on Twitter is insane.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you don't have to do the work to. Well, I mean, you have to do the work to get a good audience to do all that stuff for you, I suppose. But it's not like I've got to bring up 6 tabs and do my research and read all the
I,
reviews and all that stuff.
I've seen high quality responses with people with hundreds of followers, right? Because it just amplifies because other people are curious about the answer too. And that's one of the biggest values of Twitter, where you're doing it in public, other people amplify amplify it because they are curious too. They want the answer. And all it takes is someone with 10,000 followers to amplify it, and it'll get your 50 responses or whatever.
Yeah. Actually, this could lead us into the abundance of like emails and things like that, content on the internet. So with Twitter, for example, I've noticed a certain subset of people who are building a brand to sell a course or sell a community or sell something, kind of like what I did, but I did it unintentionally. I didn't try and I wasn't doing certain types of tweets, certain
Yep.
cadence of it to try and do that thing. Um, but now I see like you can see certain people have a very similar, like the tweet structure is the same, and it's all about like sharing the quotes or trying to have it really philosophical or something. Do you think that is just contributing to just like abundance of content, but tweet based, I suppose? And it's sort of that's the similar thing that we're seeing everywhere else, which is just like, okay, I get your point where you're building stuff without code and you can do it without code. You don't need to tell me 5 times a day in different like ways that no code is the best because of this thing. Like if I'm just repackaging the same point.
You're what you're gonna see, and what you see is people have a lot of energy for doing that until they get exhausted. And you see this like this is like continuous. So you essentially have a massive public forum where everyone can see everything everyone else does if they want to. The search box on Twitter is extremely powerful. Like you don't need hashtags. Like I don't understand like why
Yeah,
you would even dream of hashtags at this point on Twitter.
yeah,
Instagram's a whole different story, but Twitter, like it's text medium. Putting the hash in something just screws up people's brains when they see it.
yeah,
And so you have this public forum. You see people watch other people and have success and try to extract the patterns out and then repeat them. And the thing that I've learned about this is it's very psychological. And what I mean by that is, and I've seen like, you know, I'm not going to call them famous, but like public company CEOs get on Twitter, get a win, like a win, meaning like 1,000 retweets plus, right? First win, and it might have been like a thread or something, and then they start tweeting about their breakfast and their pizza that they're eating. And I think in my head, I know what happened there. You just get a high from tweeting and getting a response and that dopamine hit, and then you keep doing it. And I feel like what happens in the example you gave is that there are a bunch of patterns people start seeing, and then they imitate them, and then they keep imitating them because they work. And they work just means some vanity metrics around reach and amplification, etc. And then they get exhausted at some point because you can't keep doing that, because that is like a cookie cutter, like you just keep doing it. And it's not like you're going to lose followers. You'll gain followers, but what happens is what your followers came to you for is that consistent like repetition of some kind, because otherwise why would they follow you? If they would unfollow you if they didn't like it. So somebody,
yeah,
they liked it, it's there. um, and then you get exhausted of that type of content. And the reason is it's cookie cutter. It's not necessarily easy to do either. It's still hard because you can't, like, unless you're Jason Calacanis, not to blow up his spot, you're not going to copy someone else's tweet. You're just not. There are a few people that will shamelessly. He's one of them, and he's done it, and no judgment that he's like messing with Twitter just like all of us. But like, there's no end to that. So what I found, because I've played with every format that I feel comfortable with. There's a bunch I don't, but almost every format I can. And what I realize is like when you think in formulas and formats on Twitter, you actually lose the value and the beauty of Twitter. And so I think like it takes a lot more thought to do the harder stuff that's actually better, if you want to call it that, for your brand. Well, yeah, better for your brand. It's not even if you want to call it that. It's much easier to do the cookie cutter stuff, but you burn out faster if you think of it like that. Because then you're on some treadmill. And these days, I think of the treadmill analogy a lot. Partly because of Will Smith, who says, if you get on a treadmill and I get on a treadmill, I'm either dying or you're getting off first, right? And that's awesome. But the treadmill I'm talking about is like the repetition of something that if you get off it, you fall down. Because it's going to keep going. It's going to stay on. There's no off button. And that's what happens a lot with some of these sort of this style of tweeting. But it's because it's publicly available and everyone can see other people's success. Like right now, the pattern I see is like, and I don't blame these folks for it, it's just their style, but this idea of like, I keep trying to say 37 signals, but again, that dates me too. But the folks at Basecamp, you know, they pick a fight, they pick an enemy, and they go after that enemy in as many ways as possible. I'm seeing a lot of folks on Twitter starting to do a little bit more of that. And yeah, and it's okay. It's okay. Like people are gonna do it, but like I don't know. Like if that's not you, don't do it. I mean,
Yeah,
they
yeah,
do it. They do it super well, and they own it. They just own it. Like, and it's not actually out of hate. It's not out of. I had to like. I misunderstood it until like
yeah.
I started like seeing what they're doing and why they're doing it. They're like, look, we have a point of view, and we don't care what you think about our point of view. We have a point of view, and we're going to share it. What I'm seeing a lot more of is not that. I'm seeing a lot more of like hating for the sake of hating.
It's interesting seeing. There's a couple of differences that I'm seeing too. So one is like, okay, I'll use myself as an example, but with someone else's form, which is no coding is the best thing you can do, which I do believe, but I don't repackage a tweet in several different ways every single day and just use it as that. And there's a lot of folks who do that because, like you said, they have one win and then the next one hits, and the next one hits because it's all a tribe of people who think no coding is the best thing you can do. So they just keep doing that and keep filling up your dopamine. And then there's another style which Sahil from Gumroad does really well, where his tweets, he knows he's setting them up as like really shareable, like startup tidbits or whatever. But what he's doing is he does it from the things that he had to go through that day or things he's thought of that day, like what do I learn from this experience? It's about a startup journey rather than just like building digital, selling digital products or something. And I don't know how to pronounce his name, Chetan from Benchmark. He's one of my favorite followers on Twitter recently, where he has a form, as in the tweet looks the same about these like big public companies, and just talks about, okay, so Workday had 2017 48% services revenue versus whatever product, and he just like breaks them down. But that's like new stuff and it's relevant stuff. It changes all the time, so that's like really interesting. So I'd love to see like how I think stuff is creeping into email newsletter stuff, because people start a Substack because they think, well, I've got an audience, I've got a community, let's like build a brand off this, and then now my writing continues to be more of the same. I'm just like extending my point further and longer characters and more characters, and then it's like you said, adding to the same pool of content which hasn't changed much. The learnings haven't changed much. So then how does the hits are a lot less or infrequent unless they're individual viewpoints on a relevant topic at a relevant time in a certain structure that works. How many newsletters do you subscribe to?
Way too many. Way too many. The better question is like, how many am I reading?
Well, wouldn't the same thing Shouldn't it be that you just unsubscribe from the ones you don't read?
No, I keep them because a lot of them like are interesting sometimes, but not interesting all the time. You know, here's a messed up thing, right? Like the relevance of that content to you right now matters more than anything else. And so
Yeah,
unsubbing is like, well, you know, if I like the writer and I like the way they write and I like appreciate it, I might keep it, but only open it when I feel like it, right? And I think that's where we're headed. That's where we are. Um, but that's also how I mean it even goes back to that double-edged sword I'm talking about. You know, I was talking about earlier, which is like, who am I to say a piece of content should not exist or is shitty?
yeah,
Like, who am I to say that? Because if it's good for someone and someone's going to get value from it, by all means, it probably should exist. Um, and that's a double-edged sword. It's the same thing with email. It's like, it's just not relevant to me. That's why I go for the grandpa move now, because I'm like, yo, like, and there's someone, a friend of mine I used to call grandpa because, like, he's definitely grandpa compared to me. But, like, these days I'm like, nah, dude, I've turned into him. Like, I feel cranky about things, and I feel like, you know, like, when I talk to a lot of these people, like folks who are kind of newer to tech, starting their first thing, I used to be able to give them context about whatever they're trying to do that was relevant to them really fast, that they understood because of some historical relevance, right? Like I could talk about 37 signals and give some frameworks or some ideas. These days I can't. So it's kind of interesting because their frame of reference is literally like, you know, I was on Twitter and Sahil said X or Naval said Y. And I'm like, you know, you could even talk to those two and they would tell you like, don't listen to anything I tweet. Like, it doesn't matter, right? Like, it's like,
yeah.
I'm tweeting because I want to. I'm tweeting because that's what I do. I'm not tweeting necessarily because you should go do what I say, right? And that I think is lost on people in a lot of ways, especially with Twitter. And so these days, when they say all that, I'm like, well, have you thought through if what they're saying is actually relevant to you and how it's relevant to you? And usually the answer is no.
Yeah. But yeah, it's like saying that he's saying that because that's relevant to him and the company he has after having the experiences he has, with the interest he has, all of the other pieces.
I mean,
That's
half the things, if not more, that both of them tweet, I'm like, no, it's bad advice. Like, it's just
yeah,
bad advice. But like, if you're taking it as advice, that's the problem, right? Even me, like reading it as advice, that's the problem. It's not. It's a single person's experience and their thought. It's almost like you know, back in the day, you had like Karl Marx and you had like all these other folks, and they've written a bunch of books, and either you believe it or you don't, right? Either it resonates or it doesn't. But it's not really advice, and that's the weird thing. Advice is like, hey, you're in this situation. Here's like how you can think about it from my sort of perspective, right? That's advice. That's not a tweet. A tweet is not advice.
no. I think people just we're all almost conditioned to. I've got to read that thing right now. It's got to be relevant right now. That's the thing for me at this point, and we forget the fact that you should just let things go. Even things like your inbox, and there's loads of emails come in. You're thinking, okay, well, I'll get to those at some point, like this week, and you don't do it, and you're like, oh, I'll do it next week at some point when some some part of your universe like connects, motivated to that. And if I mean that just it's a thing that you're not expected to happen probably, so just get rid of them, and it's not your obligation to reply. But it's the same with the tweets and newsletters. I find the same. And it's like, oh, I need to put them somewhere. So that at some point when I'm thinking, oh, communities, I was thinking about communities. So let's look at all the things I saved. And this is why I use Pocket. And people will complain about Pocket, but like saving, bookmarking articles because they're like, oh, I never get through it, as if it's a thing to complete. It's not the point. The point is, it should be a reference thing. So then when you're thinking, oh yeah, I remember I was trying to figure out B2B sales, did I tag some stuff that I saw along the way?
It's like your personal encyclopedia.
Yeah,
You don't get through an encyclopedia.
no,
That's not the point, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think, I mean, yeah, I like having all this. And only recently I've started having more newsletters, putting them in a split inbox, checking through them. If one day I'm just like, I don't want to read anything today, just clear them, and then they're not there to haunt me the next day when I haven't read it, or if I don't want to read it. Like it's okay if that idea comes back up and it's good, or it's being shared on Twitter from my crowd. I'll see it then as well. So like people just,
Yeah,
I
I
think
think
people worry.
that anxiety should be pretty low for most people of like missing out on something at this point. It'll
Yeah,
show up. You don't need to be first. You don't need to be early. And that contextual relevance to what you're concerned about or thinking about right now, it's also how books work. It's how content generally works, right? It's like if it's relevant to you right now and you read it, you're going to get a lot out of it. If you read it a year ago, it might not mean anything to you. If you read it a year from now, it might have a completely different meaning. And I think that's what a tweet's like. That's what blog posts are about. I mean, it's just about the relevance to the human being who's reading it right now. And so, in a way, it's like I don't think the fatigue's going to go away, and I don't think the amount of content is going to get. It's not going to reduce. It's just going to get more, and the formats are going to get different and get iterated on. Even a tweet storm is really a listicle, in a lot of ways, if not a
yeah,
blog post in some ways, right?
yeah.
And it's just a different format, same type of material.
What do you think's going to happen when instead of text or writing, it becomes more of a, oh, that was on a podcast and that was on a video I saw, and then all these formats are actually across different media formats.
Your level of attention with these different mediums is what really dictates how much they spread. So in podcasting, your level of attention on the podcast is high. Your level of attention on everything else is relatively low, except the one thing you're doing while you're listening to the podcast. So if you're cooking while you're listening to the podcast, your attention is mostly on the podcast from a just listening standpoint, but your attention on everything else is consumed by the thing you're doing, right? And so when you think of it that way, I can't see a world where you're going to have lots of content coming out of podcasts by the listeners, because the listener's job is not to sit there and listen to the podcast and do nothing else. While when you're reading content, your job, like what you're doing, is you're sitting there reading the content. You can literally maybe listen to music at the same time, maybe, depending on who you are, but not really. What you're
Yeah,
really doing is you're reading that content. You're not really doing anything else. You're consumed by it. It's on your phone or it's right in front of your computer. And so that is more conducive to you having the attention to abstract something out of it and share it or take notes or whatever. So I find podcasting, even video, has kind of a similar issue in my mind, where if your attention's on it, it's there, but the ways to extract information from a video and share it is actually not that compelling. Like it's very hard to do. It's
yeah,
like screenshots and crap like that. So I'm not saying there needs to be tools or anything like that. I'm sure there will be because
yeah,
there's tools for everything these days. But I think my point is like we have to think about the medium and what people are doing when they're engaging with it and where their attention is. If you think about it that way, then we'll go back to text content because that is the content that gets the most attention when someone's consuming it. Even more than video, even though like people might look at me like thinking I'm crazy, but if the intention is that there's value that comes out of it and gets shared, video video it's easy to be like, "Yo, watch this video." With content, it's easier to be like, "Yo, read this article. Actually, here's like my favorite sentence from it." Right?
yeah,
Like it's much easier to share that and talk in that language than saying, "Here's the best clip from this hour-long talk." How do you get that out and share it with somebody and make it a thing? You don't. Like it's like it's almost impossible. And it's not tools. Tools aren't the problem. It's our cognitive load and how much attention we have on the thing. So it's not that your attention's less on a video. It's just that your ability to do something with it, to spread it, is a lot less. While on text, it's like a couple clicks, right?
yeah. I mean, I can't do, even when I'm working, if I'm in like the zone of doing something, I forget that there's nothing on in the background at all. I'm just like, maybe that's how I'm supposed to be working. But if I'm trying to listen to a podcast, I can't do one or the other. I go back and forth. I'm just like, why do I even try? Even like, I quite like TV on in the background that's something like really shitty to watch. It just plays all day, and I can work to that. That's fine. If it's like more menial tasks, I guess, or even just like website stuff. But yeah, podcast, I have to be exercising, otherwise I, I never listen to it, or I'm going for a walk or something. But yeah, I struggle to like feel like I have to fit them in because then like, well, I want to try and make sure I'm listening to it so I can get the thing out of it. Even if I'm on the bike and I listen to something, I try and do like a panting voice note to myself saying like, say this sentence, I'll do it, I'll get off, see that it says like absolutely fucking nothing what I remembered, and I was like, don't even know what that was, so I'm not going to go back to like, am I going to go through this hour-long podcast to try and find it? Nope. So guess that's out.
And it's funny, like I love Audible because they let you just with a tap bookmark a piece of like bookmark anytime, and you can write a note on it. And because of the way podcasts are decentralized, it's almost impossible to like do that. I haven't seen an app that does that. But even that, like, you're doing something else usually when you're listening to podcasts, as you mentioned, and it's nonsensical. So that's why I think the relevant to me right now is really where content, like where the content that kind of hits somebody really like works. That's why you'll see. I mean, and this is just how humans are. Like that's why humans love news, because news tends to be eternally relevant in the moment when it shows up for you, right? If right now, like somehow you got an Apple News like notification, even on your computer, and it was some crazy thing, you probably would get distracted by it right now because it's just relevant, right? So news is an interesting paradigm to study if you're thinking about content and attention and sort of, what to do about kind of the current situation of abundance.
Yeah. So what do you think people should be doing or could be doing to try and I mean, I've got my community hat on right now because I was chatting with Greg, so that's sort of
Yeah.
how I'm looking at it. And he's talking about if you start putting out content, which is how you then draw these people to your centre of gravity and across these interest groups, which I think is really actually wasn't going into the conversation with necessarily mindset. But it's the things you put out that draw the people in to you. But then if there's 15 newsletters someone subscribed to, am I going to subscribe to another one? Does it get harder every week because you're missing, well, quote unquote, missing the fact that you didn't get them sooner? Is it more like getting into product territory where I was saying this is why we do a lifetime model because you've got your Shopify, Spotify, you've got Netflix, you've got Disney Plus, you've got so many monthly subscriptions and only so much time. At some point, you start thinking, well, I didn't use that this month or last month, so I turn it off. Like, does it get into that territory of I've got to make sure that every piece of content is way better or way higher quality, and then actually does that help the whole situation go around?
I think it completely depends on the context of the community. So, who's the audience? What do they sign up for? And what is the value delivery mechanism? So, the best counterexample, which is not paid, but it's close, is Seth Godin. He writes short stuff. His stuff is high quality. He's got a style, right? People would probably pay for that style. I mean, they have in his books, right? But they'd probably pay a subscription to hear more stuff from Seth. That's fascinating. That to me kind of breaks a lot of the mold around worrying about things like quality from the aspect of depth or quantity, and makes you think about kind of why does Seth Godin's content work, and really like thinking through what is the type of content that will create the community you want, and then help make sure that that community and the way that they treat your content is relevant to them and relevant to you to keep creating. And so a lot of times the communities have been started because, and I see a lot of this, especially with like investors, for example. Almost every investor that's like a fund somehow thinks they need a Slack group or a Slack like team, and they're building a community. It is a community of their founders, but the commonality is the venture fund, which is no offense to them. They need to exist, but they're just money. And then it's like, well, if I've raised a bunch of money from a bunch of people, am I going to be part of like 10 different Slack groups from these 10 different investors? And that's a fascinating question, right? And in a category where like I don't know how the investors can continuously deliver value to that audience, but yet there is a power dynamic, right, and some form of an obligation. So I'm not ignoring that, but it's a good case study in community because it, it's the type where it's relevant to me because they invested in my company, but it's also the type where I might not care about the content that much. And
Yeah.
that kind of proves a point of like, if you're a community, if you're creating community, like the best communities are when the content feels relevant to the audience every single time. And it has to feel relevant to enough of the audience and enough of the time. So that's like the bar. And so the best communities that I've seen are just like the best products that have a strong affinity with the audience and a deep understanding of that audience and their needs in the context of why they're there. So like you find a lot of these founder communities that are created by investors, they are usually whatever content the investor wants to promote or whatever webinar they want to do because they want to provide and add value. And there's some form of discussion, but the thing is, the alternative to getting the information you can get from that community, there's many alternatives.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I discussed this with Greg about, we're talking about people, you can sign up for a product that gives you like a forum out of the box and you say, here we go, you can go build a community. It's like, well, it's very, very difficult to do that. And people would always ask me after product, and they said, can you, like, I want to build a community for my product. Can you help us? I was always just like, no, probably not. That's not like the point. And it doesn't matter that you just have like a Slack group or Telegram group or whatever it is. And I found it interesting recently because MakerPad is a learning community, but we come together around no code building. And then, so I was trying to look at like what are similar sites that have a really strong community, but that don't do like just a Slack group or a forum. So I looked at GitHub, which has a huge community. There's no GitHub Slack that I know of. Not that I'd be in it, but there's that. So then I looked at Webflow, I looked at Figma. None of these have official like Slack groups. Webflow's got like a forum, which is discourse, so you have like a separate sign-in for that. And I was always like, no, it's got to have single sign-on with this and this. Everything's going to be connected. And then you look at companies that are loved by their community who just don't do that. And it's like, this is why it's not just about, oh, let's build a community, right? We've got a forum, yes. Have you got customers? Yes. There you are. That's your community, because that's not the point. The point is the shared commonality, how much like love and affiliation there is there with what you put out as a company, rather than just, hey, you two should chat because you use the same tool.
Yeah, community doesn't work without brand affinity. And all those brands have affinity because of the utility they provide in people's lives. It's very basic, right?
Yeah.
And so they can almost do anything and get away with it because they didn't, I mean, these people didn't start from scratch.
Yeah.
Figma didn't start with a community, they started with a tool. And then the community kind of got around the tool. And one of the best places to look is Twitter and see if there's a community forming on Twitter around what you're doing or what
Yeah.
your business is. And if there is, whether it's because of you or not, there's probably a massive opportunity to consolidate, all those people in one place in the right ways, and
Yeah.
and then it's on. So in a way, like I think your whole site is your community, just like GitHub, and that's probably the way I would play it out if it were me.
Yeah. No, that makes sense for sure. And yeah, I mean, like Reddit, there's a subreddit for everything, right? And like they're miniature communities within community. Um,
Yeah, and as much as I like talking about communities, I'm by no means any expert. I actually really rely on David Spinks. I think he's the community expert at this point.
yeah.
I know he's helped a lot of organizations. At the same time, like I do think about brand a lot, and I think community and brand go together in extreme ways, um, and it can go both ways. You can mess up a good brand by messing up the community pretty
Yeah.
quickly too. I think Dig is a good example of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think just it becomes one of the first things people think about, thinking, okay, well, I can write blog posts, build a community, then I can sell them something. So that's like how to become how this can work. And then people talking about community being remote, but it's like there's real ways to actually build a community. It's not about the tools or certain things like that. I gotta get David on because yeah, I'm gonna chat with him about all this stuff for sure. I, I just wanted to mention briefly before we wrap up about the reinvention of the product studio. So Greg has launched this product studio which has like they invest in some companies to do with internet communities. They build some companies to do with internet communities, and then they work with other internet communities as like clients. I've always loved the studio model in theory, but it's always seemed to be like backed by a venture capitalist or a venture firm or something, where it never really comes out cool in the end. It always seems to be like some sort of failure or didn't quite work out the way that it should have. Like all the ingredients seem to be there, and maybe it's just not right for venture. Do you think that more people are going to start having this? Oh yeah, I've got a newsletter. I also build a few products that are to do with no code, for example, and then I also work with some companies on no code stuff on my own little studio, and this is how this is my brand, and you build a community around that. Do you think there's any, do you think it will increase?
Oh, this is a heck of a topic. It's just a heck of a topic, and the reason for that is like I don't I think we're giving a name to something that has a different name, and the different name, it's called experimentation, and it's how businesses are built. And so to me, when I hear studio, I hear a lab, and I hear that you're going to do a bunch of experiments, and there's a format for these experiments. So Greg's format is there's a playbook he's probably got or thinking of, and he wants to see more communities and people who want to create them and wants to sort of influence them. Right? I'm not even going to say fund. I think it's really influence at that point, and have a say in how they're built. That's his lab. And we've had that construct forever. We've had it in schools, we've had it in pharma, we've had it everywhere. It's a lab, and these are experiments, and some of them will work, some of them will fail. That's it. And I think like the way that folks have historically thought of this is where the problem lies. And the folks have historically thought of it like, I'm going to build a bunch of these, and this is just one model, but it is what I've seen is kind of the where the name comes from in a way, where it's like we're going to build a bunch of these. We're gonna get them funded, and they're gonna like spin out of the studio. What
Yeah,
ends up happening with that model usually is that one thing gets spun out of the studio, one thing, because out of all those experiments, they realize that like there's one thing that got all the attention and was driving it, or they just fail because it wasn't a good model. The incentives are not aligned with the people that are working on it, and something just breaks. So I'm not at all not like into this. I think it's a great thing, but we should call it a set. It's a method for experimentation, and
yeah,
and we should call it that, and realize that like it's not a viable way to come up with lots and lots of ideas, and I mean lots of successful businesses. It's not necessarily the way that lots of successful businesses get kind of popped out. That being said, like if you're doing one where the intention is we're going to help build a number of different communities, that's a little bit different in my mind because it's experimentation using a methodology with a
Yeah.
specific like construct of communities. That's like almost saying we're going to build as many, like we're going to run a studio and build productivity tools, right?
Yeah, or even
It,
like a podcast in a certain format around a certain topic and
yeah,
spin out different
yeah,
shows.
and in the productivity tools, I kind of say that on purpose because it's like, well, should it just be one tool, and you just keep
Yeah,
adding features to it? Probably, most likely. While with the community, it can't. I mean, the big debate, and this is, I know you had the call with him, and I don't know what the content was, but like, isn't Reddit just it? Like, and the answer is no. The answer is actually every community has special needs in a and if you can deliver on those special needs, your version of that community will be better than the subreddit. And I think your business is a good example of that. I'm sure there's a no code subreddit.
yeah, it's just not very active. So I didn't start there, which is great because that's not what we handle, obviously. So
So, you know, in your case, I think it makes sense. It's just a way to run experiments and give it a fancy name. But at the end of the day, it's like it's one person running experiments or a team running experiments and bringing on other people to run experiments with them. That's a studio.
yeah, awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on.
Always fun.
I think we've filled the time quite well without having any agenda whatsoever. Have you got any final thoughts from any of the content community chat we just had?
I don't know. I think we're in a brave new world in many different ways, and uh, it's just really interesting to see how what kind of conversations are coming up now that like you know this is the reality we live in with like so much online
Yeah,
and so much abundance of content. It's an abundance of content,
yeah,
and I mean it's no surprise. Like there's always been an abundance of content in different areas. I think there's just an abundance of content right now in many different topics, many different personalities, many different personalities, many different mediums, lots of options, and you know the fatigue always sets in when there's abundance. Like just think about constipation and all the things that happen when you overeat. Same kind of
yeah.
thing, you know.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I appreciate you coming on. I think you've already told the folks where to find you on Twitter.
Yep,
We should do it again.
sounds good.